Hey Ryan, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me? Thanks, Jerry. Hoping everybody can hear me as well. Really excited to be here today. Uh, my video is not working, so you are fortunate enough to not have to see my mug, which is pretty nice. Pretty amazing to see everybody joining in. It looks like we have almost every continent, maybe except Antarctica, here with us today. So I'm really excited and thrilled to be with you here. As Jerry mentioned, we're going to walk through a case study, which is about our internal design system here at Electronic Arts. So why don't we just get into it and catch up later when we get to the Q&A. So if you have been aware of anything right now, design systems are all the rage. You will find countless people speaking and teaching and talking about them. Wonderful people like Gina Bolton, Nathan Curtis, Charlotte Jackson, Diana Mounter, Dave Cronin, and others are really driving the conversation for us and sharing their knowledge with us, and that's fantastic. And they're doing so also through companies. There's wonderful work going on at WeWork and Atlassian and Salesforce and GE, IBM, just to name a few. And if you do simply a search on Medium or come join a webinar like this with UXPin, you will find a no limited number of articles and videos on design systems. And if you're here today for one of those conversations, I'm afraid this is not one of those talks. Instead, we're going to talk about Electronic Arts, so EA, the video game and entertainment company, and an internal system we've developed here and designed here called Joystiq. So before we get into Joystiq a little bit, I just want to talk about us a little bit more. So at EA, you know us for these wonderful games, Battlefield and Battlefront, Mass Effect, FIFA, etc. And our team, unfortunately, doesn't have really anything to do with these games. We have great colleagues who are working on these games. Instead, we work inside the IT organization. You can really tell it's IT because I've had to change the font over to Arial. And what hopefully some of you are not just melting in your chair going, wow, I've joined this webinar and we're going to talk about IT. Don't worry, there's cool stuff ahead. Our team is comprised of some fantastic people. These are our full-time staff, and with our consultants and with our vendors, we run anywhere between 12 and say 15 people, but we have backgrounds in HCI, computer sciences, history, communication design. We run a broad spectrum of expertise and backgrounds, and depending on who our clients are, we really have three operating models. We either operate as a consultancy, a service, or directly on product teams. Really, when you're talking as a consultancy, that's where we're providing a lot of strategic exercises. We kind of help other teams at EA get unstuck, services like design sprints and research and prototyping, journey maps, all these types of things. When it comes to a service, that's largely where Joystiq comes into play, where we've developed this design system. We then develop a lot of what we call tiny guides around the design system, which is almost like our version of design education. And lastly, we're product designers. So we are also working on applications, websites, other things like that. And our primary focus here at EA is what we call player experience and employee experience. In this role, we provide like that horizontal service, but we work really closely with executives over in our studio organizations, HR, CTO, finance, and legal. And what we're constantly looking at is to identify what we call the perceived value, either in the value that players have in interactions with us as a company, or the perceived value that employees have in their interactions while working here at EA. So let's just skip to the chase and talk about just what is Joystiq, first of all. So Joystiq is a collection of resources that we have for individuals and teams here at EA to design and develop internal applications, websites, content strategies. Some may think of this as enterprise UX, if you will, and Joystiq is really here to support us internally around those types of activities. So why might we need a design system? A lot of that comes down to how we are structured. So EA is a global company, and we have offices all over the place. This is a small sample of some of these offices. We are very much a decentralized matrixed organization. So there's not very many central services. Our team does provide a central service, but most are sort of vertical spaces, really in the studio type of space. And when you are thinking about, say, the employee experience, I'll give you a quick example as to why, say, a design system might be relevant. So if you think about EA or any other large company, they really start out with the employee experience by creating a job description, posting it out there, and then evaluating many different people for that job to eventually hire someone like Mary. Because Mary has what we call inherent expertise. The job that it's posted, it's typically looking to fill a gap of expertise, and we hired people like Mary to fill that gap. But when Mary arrives with her first day on the job, like at many other companies, she's sort of enters a world where we have lots of different applications and sites, things that have to deal with career development and learning management and support and travel and all these types of things. And all of those sites, applications, and content is really managed by separate teams. It is really a world of systems out there that Mary is introduced to. And in many cases, when you are working for large companies, maybe even small companies, what you have is Mary being stuck in the middle of these systems and sort of having one-to-one relationships with all these organizations. And what that does for Mary is create a lot of accidental complexity for her. She deals with a lot of efficiency issues of having to go with these one-on-one relationships. Just to give you a sample of what that might look like here at EA, we have all sorts of different applications and sites that we use, but think of the typical workday, and you might go through a bunch of different sites and applications like this, where they have different patterns, different information architecture, different content strategies. And what that does for Mary is really creates an experience where she feels like she's all alone. So what we want to do, our team, when we're focused on, say, the employee experience, is we want to create an experience that is end-to-end. Really think of the whole life cycle of how Mary might interact with different applications or sites, content and people and services. All in one sort of experience. And what that does for us is that creates challenges with scale, reusability, and craft. I think you see this as a familiar theme with lots of design systems out there. So we kind of have this backdrop, right, for why a design system might be needed and why we might want to sell one. But we're also designers. And what we needed to start out by doing was really understanding what first needed buying, what might our user base, what might our stakeholders be interested in buying before we go about trying to sell something. I love this this little quote from Jared Spool. He's been pitching services for 23 years and he's never once successfully convinced an executive of anything. What that really means is that we had to start to understand who might be influential in helping us with a design system. So we really started with evaluating the value proposition for two different groups of humans. The first, those who design and develop. It's really important that we support the people who are doing the work. And then secondly, also understanding the perspectives of those who always want us to ship things faster and cheaper. When you talk to leadership teams, executives, typically they're going to want to always be influenced or talk about money or time, and making good things faster and cheaper. So rather than starting from scratch, we like to remix a lot and use a lot of the same tools that we use out there, say, for building an application. So what we started out was using this tool from a company called Strategizer, called the Value Proposition Canvas. It's a wonderful model framework that is used in a larger model or framework for what they call the business proposition or business value canvas. And so what this model has done, what this canvas does, is lead you through activities to sort of see what pains or what potential gains there are for a customer. But instead of focusing on the customer, what we ended up doing is looking at the jobs that designers do, developers do, and really executives do, and what pains and gains they might have that a design system might evaluate. So if you think about those designers, we again looked at the broad map of where our designers all are and really identified that many of the designers were kind of working in same types of tools. Here at EA, there were tools like InVision and UXPin and Photoshop and Sketch and all these types of things. But when we were looking at quotes and sort of from the research that we did, what we were seeing is a lot of designers were seeing things like this, getting emails like this. Hi, designer, we're launching an application tomorrow, and I'd like to get your feedback before we do, the day before an application launches. Or can you make my thing look like your thing? Is another common thread. And for us designers, that again, that kind of makes us want to melt. There's stuff that we do that is more than just making it look like something else. When we looked or worked with our developer friends, what we found was that there at EA, here at EA, there's a tremendous amount of freedom in sort of the frameworks and the stacks that developers and engineers use. That is not the same case at every company, but here at EA, we have a lot of freedom to sort of decide what type of frameworks and stacks we might use in building various products and services. And what was common for those developers is that they use a lot of tools that come with great documentation as well, and sort of great websites that come with it. And the types of feedback we heard from developers is that they would try to figure out how to make the best button. That they would do their best when not working with a designer to do the right thing. But ultimately, they would just grab a framework because they needed to get work done. So we saw a lot of quotes and a lot of feedback related to time, that they didn't have time to incorporate style guides because they needed to ship. Now, if you think about, say, style guides in general, they've been around for a long time. And perhaps why they aren't incorporated or haven't been incorporated very well is because a lot of the work that needed to be done to apply those style guides to, say, an application was all on the developer. Designers would, say, take a design and what we call red lines and provide a lot of this documentation. I'm sure a lot of you still have to do this. But then at the end of the day, a developer still has to find the time to incorporate all of your paddings and margins and line heights and these types of things to get that pixel perfect design in there. What we saw as well from developers is why they were constantly under this pressure is when we hear from our stakeholders, our executives, what we have is a lot of our leadership constantly asking for new things. If anybody's familiar with a VP over at Slack, a VP of engineering named Michael Lopp, he's been around For a long time, he worked at Apple previously, and he had this great talk probably about 10 years ago where he talked about ponies. And it's in jest, but really what we have is a lot of leadership teams asking for more, and they want another thing, and they want another pony. And typically they want it faster and cheaper than they got their last version. So there's all this pressure. And what we identified was that really most people, when it came down to design or development or even our executive friends, everybody was really focused on pain points around time. That there was difficult or incomplete documentation, or picking or implementing a framework, that the various learning curves of skills here, and all while they still have to do browser testing and debugging. And the constant pressure to fine-tune fonts and colors that we designers continually push on, and having to design from the ground up and recreating the same components. What it all boils down to is a lot of people are constantly pushing to get that extra time. So what really needed buying, this is kind of a made-up quote, was something where everybody wants to collaborate. They want to have great documentation. They want to have choice in their tools. They want to contribute back. That was a big thing. Our stakeholders always wanted to contribute back to something. They still wanted to save time and money, and they wanted to make their things look like our things. But all sounds great. What was a coincidence maybe was my arrival here at EA. I had bad timing. So my hire date was April 13th of 2015, which means that was 13 days after our fiscal year started, which in reality meant that all headcount was finalized. When I arrived here, I didn't actually have any available headcount to hire anybody full-time. It meant all projects were finalized. All of the business requirements, all of the agreed projects to be done in that fiscal year were already finalized, and all budgets were finalized, which meant primarily all the money that was going to be resourced to making things had all been allocated to other things, which then left me thinking, oh my gosh, did I miss the boat? Am I too late to actually get something like a design system done? Turns out I didn't panic too much. What I instead began to think about are the complications of money. When thinking about budgets and headcount and projects, money brings into a situation other complications. Money typically comes with ownership and governance and committees. A lot of people, when they are applying, say, a budget to something, they then want to control the outputs of what happens. And so what we had to kind of sit back and look at is, well, let's think about design systems and projects. Projects are what bring a lot of that headcount and money and budgets and some of those complications. But at the sort of the crux of it, the base of it, design systems are should be delivered and continue to live, while projects should deliver and die. And so really, should we be funding a design system with a project? You'll notice the asterisk there. It was, if I had budget available and headcount available, I would have gladly taken it, but I didn't. So we had to think, how can we be successful with a design system without any funding? So we basically had to come up with the basic premise that success for this particular project, for this design system, would not be funding. And I'm going to preface that by using one of these other words that we hear a lot. We hear this word innovation a lot every day in our work. And I'm not sure it's ever really defined for us. We hear a lot of people saying, be more innovative, but what does that actually mean? So I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit. And that will help give the basis of how we thought we would be successful. So if we think of innovation, there's many ways to break it down, but if we just think about, say, incremental versus radical innovation, what we're really talking about is improvements with a given frame of solutions, doing better what we already do, versus a change of frame, doing something we did not do before. And there's a paper that was published in 2014 called Incremental and Radical Innovation, Design Research versus Technology and Meaning Change by Don Norman and Roberto Vergante. And what their basic premise was that in order to have a successful innovation, you had to have three factors that were present. That the innovation had to be novel, it had to be unique, and it had to be adopted. And what their research tells us is that the majority of innovation fails because things aren't adopted. Within their research, they were looking at radical alone and identifying that I think 96% of radical innovation fails because users don't adopt that. So what we then stated was that for our design system for Joystiq, success would be adoption. And we were going to start with that. And if we remember that design systems should deliver and live, what we really needed was sustained adoption. I'm a wholehearted believer in looking at other industries, other practices for inspiration on how they apply frameworks. And at the same time, or even previous to my time here at EA, I had been doing research with other frameworks in other industries. And one of those frameworks was came out of Stanford in 2011 called Collective Impact. And what collective impact is focused on is large-scale social change. And what they identified within this framework that in order to have sustained adoption, they really needed five things to happen. What they needed was a team to take responsibility for assembling the elements of a solution, to create a movement for change, to include solutions from other sectors, to use actionable knowledge to sort of influence behavior and improve performance, and really have cross-sector coordination over, say, an individual intervention. So rather than us just going out and sitting in a dark room by ourselves, what we really needed to do was focus on coordinating with everybody, all our other stakeholders, developers and engineers and designers. And we started with simply using actionable knowledge to influence behavior and improve performance. So you might ask, great, we start with success is adoption, and we want sustained adoption, but who are those early adopters, maybe? So where we decided to focus was just on the users of those design tools and services across EA. Because what we saw from our research was that many of the projects they were working on were a little chaotic. It was SpongeBob and Patrick kind of just running around. And how they wanted to work was more in a coordinated dance. Murmuration of starlings flocking together where the integrity systems of, say, individuals don't interfere with the integrity system of the larger system. So we were great. Perfect. That's going to get us started. Let's do this. So we started out with some assumptions and hypotheses. From the assumption side, we said we're not going to have any direct funding from a project level or say sponsorship from a committee to do this. But we know that demand for design is there. We also know that we need to support a variety of teams, products, services, and platforms across the company. We must consider that EA culture of sort of where teams and individuals kind of are allowed the freedom to select their own tools. And we didn't have an explicit constraint of don't do that. So we didn't ask, say, permission, more forgiveness. And our hypotheses were these three. User adoption would be the key to success. We're going to focus on that first. That developers, engineers, and designers are more likely to use a design system if they have choice in using it, and if they can contribute back. And we knew at the end of the day that our team needed one. We were always going to be a relatively small team. We needed one, and we believed that others would welcome having one. So while I didn't have direct, say, project funding, I did have my own budget within my department, and I went out and hired a contractor, that's Andy, and a design studio out of Belfast called Little Thunder. And that allowed us to just start going and start tackling this problem. But we also, because they were just a small group of us, we also knew that we couldn't start from scratch. So I mentioned remixing before, sampling. We have the Great Biz Marquee and Vanilla Ice as examples of how they take other people's work and remix them into new work. So what we did also research was industry-wide, looking at those people who talk about design systems, looking at those companies who work on design systems, and identify and study which of those systems might work for us. And out of that, we really liked what Salesforce was doing, what Gina Bolton and the rest of the team were doing, and how they structured their design system itself. And then what Dave Cronin and his team over at GE were doing with Predix of how they sort of marketed and developed a content strategy and developed all of the sort of design education stuff around the design system. So that's where we took our inspiration. We then went back to our designer and developer friends, saw all these great frameworks and tools that they were working on, and sort of said, we just need to start from somewhere. So we're just going to start here. We're just going to start with these basic tools and see where that gets us so that we can try to ship something. So we jumped into Photoshop and Sketch. You see some familiar sort of style library type things here just to establish some basic components. We then created a website with documentation that was pretty straightforward, easy to read, and identified what each of these components were. And then we also decided that what was really important is sort of a key feature of all these other tools and frameworks that the developers, designers, engineers use is there's great content strategy. All of this design system stuff is wrapped up inside of a great site with great documentation. And within that, that's where we developed a lot of guidelines and sort of articles on how people could get started and use our design system. We also built these tiny little step-by-step guides to sort of download specific packages for users to really get them going. And the last thing that we did was set up a Slack channel. So we set up a Slack instance that we could provide sort of design operations to everybody and really allow them to connect with us. So then we decided where we were going to establish this initial design system for us, and now it was all about sell, sell, sell. What we needed to really go out and find what we would say are early adopters. And we used this fancy matrix where we looked at our colleagues across EA and we asked two questions. Do they need help? And do they know that they need help? And if they knew that they needed help, we had this little sweet spot of people. And with that sweet spot, we found early adopters and we invited them to hackathons. We treated it as any other kind of design project. We did a bunch of internal hackathons where we had two caveats. We asked the participants to use Joystiq, our design system, and to solve a real world problem here at EA. And within a day or two, they were developing all these little tools using the system and giving us a lot of great feedback at the same time. We also did some guerrilla marketing and PR. So we created t-shirts. And those t-shirts, I think I printed about 60, 70 of these t-shirts and handed them out to random people who were all based at these different locations. And I simply asked them, wear the t-shirt at your office. And when somebody asks you about a Joystiq, simply give them the URL. And we knew that the website would take care of everything else. Within the website, we also created this 90-second little video that sort of had the voiceover and talked about identifying enterprise problems at EA and how this system would work for you. This is almost like the college t-shirt kind of marketing approach. And out of that initial work, out of those initial hackathons and PR, we had 6 different teams incorporating the design system Joystiq into 5 different projects immediately. We didn't ask them to, they just started using it. And they started sharing the URL with their colleagues and their friends. And they started asking questions about, can I create my own components? How can I start contributing back to this design system? And it's at that point that we told our leadership that we've done this. Once we already had an established community working, and it turns out leadership was thrilled. Hey, we always needed one of these. I can't believe you've done this work. Fantastic. So they were really supportive of us once we already had an audience and a product out there. So you might be asking, how are we doing so far? It's been about 18 months since we launched that. If you remember this kind of world that Mary was perhaps accustomed to before we arrived, the world is starting to change. And the world is starting to look a little more like this, where there's a lot of parity across our products and applications. A lot of tools being developed that start to talk about more of that whole life cycle of the employee experience and player experience. And a lot of ability for us then as product designers to start working on really interesting design problems rather than just focusing on, say, the UI stuff. Design problems where we've developed these tiny guides, as I mentioned before, tiny guides to visualize data, where we walk people through step-by-step processes to understand how they might choose the correct chart for their dashboard, the correct visual diagram based on what type of data that they have. The design system is also merged into other areas for us, creating simple Keynote and PowerPoint templates where we guide people, walk people through how to create a better presentation. And a funny thing has happened with all of these other frameworks that are still out there that we didn't focus on initially. We've had quite a bit of contribution from our user base who have developed their own plugins and helpers to essentially extend Joystiq to these other frameworks. We have .NET helpers and jQuery extensions, all developed by the community of users, which has been fantastic. And it really works well for us because then we're not really owning Joystiq, but we're sort of acting as maintainers, if you will, or just custodians of it. And really, it's owned by all of EA and all of our colleagues here. And then what we're doing now is really extending out Joystiq into larger components, more of the multiple components in a component as a larger component. So you see a lot of cards and stuff being developed now. So all organic growth. We're at 20 plus teams using it now, 15 plus projects. The community has developed all these fantastic things. It's really a showcase for success for us and really creating this community for sustained success for us. So can't have somebody from a video game company without a video game slide. That's really created a lot of fist bumps for us. Some takeaways for all of you that's really helped with us. If you build it, people will come. If you create something out there that has a place, people start using it. And we've really had a lot of great success. In fact, there are lots of people who are using the framework now that we didn't even know that they were using it till after they were using it. Secondly, if you work at a company, large or small, really embrace the culture around you. And here at EA, if we were to have come in strong-handed and told our colleagues that they must use this and they had no choice, they kind of would have ran away from us. So we really need to embrace the culture of EA around us and focus on that. So Trojan mice and Trojan horses, these are fantastic resources. Trojanmice.com is a wonderful website. It is a homage to old school web design, but it has a lot of great content in there that talks about planting these little tiny seeds of intent and then watching them grow around you. And then a fantastic book called Dark Matter and Trojan Horses, which is really developing a strategic design vocabulary, a language to talk to executives about design. So this was influential in sort of our approach to sort of working both with our colleagues and with executives. We also have to be fairly pragmatic. We know that design is, say, all of these things. But we also know that many of our colleagues who are not designers or engineers believe design is just making art. So we have to take a pragmatic approach and understand that we're not just going to run over everybody and change everybody's opinions overnight. That when it comes to a design system, it's more of the incremental change will bring radical change. What was really key for us is we determined early on that we would not launch, say, Joystiq or evangelize Joystiq until we had a clear product strategy, until we had this content and guidelines all wrapped around it. That this was really what was going to be the selling point, to have all this great documentation that came with Joystiq, because fundamentally Joystiq is a tool, that all this great documentation around it was really going to be the selling point. And lastly, we're still kind of fighting for a champion. So while I mentioned earlier that projects and money can bring headaches, projects and money also do a lot of great things too. And by and large, they bring champions. So when somebody invests, say, their quote unquote money or time into something at an executive level, they will be a champion of that. And so we're still kind of fighting for a champion. We have a lot of support, but nobody is really banging the gong to say, go out and everybody use Joystiq. But we're getting there. Lastly, I really want to give credit where credit is due. None of this happens without this fantastic team around us. I can't say enough for how amazing they are, how talented they are, how patient they are, and how much I've learned from them, all of them, to really get us to this point. And it's really their success that has driven Joystiq to where it is now. Lastly, if you'd like to read more or hear a little more, there is an article up on uxdesign.cc that I wrote quite a few months ago about selling this design system before asking for buy-in. And there's a lot more links that you can actually click through and get to there. So that's it for me. That's the talk, and I'd love to hear some feedback from you or for any questions.
Yeah, great job, Ryan. Yeah, let's open this up for questions here from folks. Meanwhile, we will go ahead and run the poll here. And just in closing, just as a quick note before we dive into Q&A, if you're interested in checking out UXPin at all, which is a full stack design platform that's powered by design systems, you can actually get a free trial on our site here if you haven't played around with that already.
We use it too. It's awesome.
Yeah, and Ryan is one of our customers. And let's see here. So we'll open this up for some questions, and we can get right into it here. And I'll also launch a poll that we, yep, go ahead and launch there. Great. Cool. So we'll wait for a few questions to come in, and then we will tackle them in order.
I actually see a couple questions in there.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah.
I see now. Somebody just asked a question in the chat here. So,
yep.
Yeah, he's wondering how long did it take? To actually develop Joystiq?
So it took, I would say, about 4 months for us to get to a place where we were confident we sort of had a base product. Um, that, there wasn't very many of us. It was myself, Andy, and then two designers from Little Thunder that helped us out. It was Andy primarily making sort of the base system, developing it in SAS, and then the design studio Little Thunder helping us with a lot of the web stuff, but also contributing back to the core system itself. So I'd say from us to start our workshopping, do all that rapid kind of research, and then just rapid product making. It took about 4 months for us to get to that place where we said, all right, now we're ready to really kind of start cranking on some of these hackathons.
Got it. And the next question here is more around the role of Sketch. So also as a note to folks, if you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box. That's the easiest way to get to it. So this question is, what would you say was the role of Sketch in creating the design system? Was that the first phase and the actual website was the second phase, or what did that order look like?
Right. So we designed just the elements themselves in Sketch while also building the components with CSS, with SAS. We started with Sketch just in terms of making buttons and making inputs, determining colors, that were accessible, all those types of things. So we started in Sketch. We then created the counterpart CSS. And what we determined early on was that we would not have any release. We would not release any version of Joystiq without having parity between Sketch, Photoshop, and SAS. Meaning that anytime we make an update, say create a new component, whether we start in CSS, SAS, or in Sketch or Photoshop, that we would make sure that there was parity between them all before sort of announcing that release and pushing that release live. And so once we would say push a release live to the site, it would always have the current version of Sketch, Photoshop, and we use Bitbucket here, the Bitbucket URL. What has since transpired is we now use Sketch libraries, which makes it a lot easier to maintain that parity. So what then all we have to do with our users is just have them update the library, and it's always current, rather than going down and pulling an URL. We've also been using Abstract to sort of get updates to Sketch and sort of maintain version control on that end for us.
Got it. And the next question here is more around technology. So did you use any specific front-end technologies for your design system? React.js, AngularJS, Vue.js, etc.
No, that's another clear differentiator for us. We don't have any JavaScript in our design system because this is more of an EA culture thing. We decided that we were going to go SAS only because here at EA, all the engineers and developers really kind of use different JavaScript stacks. So there are people who use React, people who use Angular, people who are using Material. It's kind of all over the place. And what we didn't want to do was tell them that they were wrong, or tell them that in order to use Joystiq, that they had to change what they were doing. So that's where we went with SAS only. So the design system itself is SAS only. We then asked those people who were using React or Angular to then help us develop the plugins for it. So the community creates those extensions, and we maintain that Joystiq itself is just SAS. It's just CSS.
Gotcha. And the next question here is around the impact of the design system. So have you measured the impact of Joystiq on product development? For instance, looking at efficiency or overall consistency.
Yeah, so what we do is we said any measurement has to be within the project itself. So Joystiq doesn't have, say, inherent KPIs. Every project does. So when you look at development time for a project in 1 year versus the next year, what we would look to see is, has there been any improvement when Joystiq is applied? And for sure, it absolutely has. Projects are moving faster. Every project has different KPIs. But if you're talking about the development time, sort of the QA testing, and then usability scores, if you will, those are all improving as we go project to project, and they're incrementally improving, and we're getting a higher, say, user satisfaction rates as well. So all the KPIs that are done are through projects that have funding directly, because that's where our leadership is going to be most concerned, that where they're spending their money, they're getting that return on investment. They're getting the faster, cheaper, better product within the places where they're investing their core money.
Right. And the next question is, how much overhead does your team, or let's see.
Yep.
Yeah, how much overhead does managing the system and the contributions create for your team? So for instance, do the contributors, like other teams, have to maintain ownership and maintenance duties over the parts that they provide? Or is there, for instance, like a centralized design?
Nope. So we maintain the overhead for the SaaS part, and for, say, Sketch, Photoshop, and that SaaS component. We then tell everybody, if you're going to contribute, and what's interesting is those who contribute and say create their own overhead of those plugins, they want to maintain ownership of that. They want the credit for that. So they make that part of their daily routine. So what's been fascinating is that developers who've created all these extensions, they say, I could do more. I really like being the maintainer of the jQuery plugin, and I like that people come to me for that help. We then just maintain that SaaS part, and then we have dedicated resources, design operations, if you will, for just the SaaS part and the support of that SaaS part. Within our projects, when we're working as product designers, say, we are then, as product designers, always contributing back. So if we develop a new component that needs to go with a new product, we then have the resource who's doing that design operations create that component in SaaS for us. And then we're always kind of feeding back into the system itself and continuing to move it forward, ensure it is evolving.
And on a related note, how do you gather feedback from the users of the design system? So for instance, is there like an issue board?
Yeah, so that's what we use Slack for. So Slack, we have channels related to development, what's working well, what's working not. We have a general support channel, and that has been fantastic. So it's really that one-to-one, rather than set up help desk tickets. We're not formal that way. It's more of the hippie commune approach rather than, say, a formalized help desk. But because we have dedicated resources to Joystiq, we're always able to respond really quickly with that feedback and say, if there ever is a bug in CSS or something's not quite working, we can provide that feedback. Here's how you should use it. And that complements our written documentation quite well.
Got it. And the next question is, since your components have to span the spectrum of multiple teams and projects and products, what principles or strategies have you used to decide which components and elements work best?
Yeah, so we don't have anything that is, say, majorly complex. There, as you know, there are systems that can get into really complex. We're just not there yet. Most of the products that we're working on, we get away with not having, we don't need that. So from the standpoint of developing new components, that's where we go through the project work. And thus far, we haven't had to encounter, major things that you don't see in a lot of other systems out there. Where complexity arises is when you start to put multiple components, say, together to form a new component. I can tell you that probably one of the more difficult things is still calendar, date picker type stuff, especially when you're talking without JavaScript. And that's where a lot of the plugins kind of work with us. And so we have to kind of decide how deep we want to go with just Sass. And where we would then work, say, with a developer directly in developing a JavaScript component for what they might need. We're still kind of early on, too.
Got it. And the next question is, so is Joystiq a standalone frame, or do you do like side loads from sketch files or something like that?
So it is standalone now. We're not doing the rad stuff that, say, the Airbnb team is doing yet. There's a lot of amazing stuff. Now that side loading stuff, and that all involves JavaScript frameworks, right? So there's the Airbnb team are doing some really amazing things, as are others. And that's where we kind of look to our engineering friends. And if they kind of want to go that route, we certainly can. Sketch provides us that format to do so. But we're biding our time a little bit and sort of saying, let's wait for there to be enough of an audience for that to then work with, say, our developer and engineer friends to go do that. So we're not doing it yet.
Got it. And our next question is around, we had something about challenges here. So someone is wondering, are there some ongoing challenges with the design system that you found particularly difficult to overcome?
I think the ongoing challenges are always around not the tool itself, but the challenges are always with your colleagues and your stakeholders. So when I mentioned that little graph of saying, do they need help and do they know they need help? We don't really push too hard with Joystiq when somebody says that they don't need it. What we're looking to do is use the power of, say, a mass audience to sort of drive that and evangelize that for us. So the difficulties are, of course, we want everybody to go use it right away, but we're not heavy-handed in forcing that to happen. So I think the challenges are always more with the people, right? And you still have to go out and do what designers do and speak a language where people understand and are convinced to go use your product. And that's, again, where a lot of our documentation we've seen as a difference maker. That it is EA specific, that it incorporates culture that they understand and know, and it really solves simple problems like, how do I choose the right chart for my dashboard? And once they do that, we kind of give them a Joystiq package that they can use if they want. So we sort of tempt them to then incorporate Joystiq because it's so easy to do.
Got it. And the next question is, so you talked about waiting to launch until you had everything documented and a strategy in place. And is that 100% necessary, or could somebody take a more like MVP approach to a design system, for example, on a smaller team?
Well, I mean, you could. What our MVP was, we don't think of it as viable. I'm actually not a fan of viable. I think that word has been hijacked in many ways. It feels like somebody's on a gurney at a hospital and somebody's just keeping it alive. What we think about more is minimum lovable or minimum usable. And for us in that culture, the documentation had to come with it. There are other frameworks that are used or have been built at many other companies that I've worked for, where it's just zip files or PowerPoint slides, sort of a smaller product, a smaller offering. And they really struggled with adoption. And so this key for success for us was adoption, not just having a thing, but that people were using the thing. And so that meant our minimum lovable, our minimum usable had to incorporate that. Whatever works for you is good, but for that, for us, that's what we determined as designers was what was going to be minimum for us.
Right. And we had a few questions around, are there any plans on making Joystiq public, or is it just going to be internal?
So I think there are always plans to. There's a lot that we have to do with our legal partners in order to get that way. And that's not necessarily always a straightforward path. Our approach is we hope to, and we're pushing and advocating for it to be there because we want to share it with the community. We want to share it with people out there. Because that's what we're about as designers, and so we're doing our best to get it out there. Still there?
Yep, I am here right now.
Okay.
All right, so let's see. We've got a few more questions here that we'll answer. We are coming up on the end of the hour. So let me see here. So there's a few questions around user research as well. So when you were creating this design system, was there any sort of usability testing or user research that was involved in making sure that the components were
absolutely
usable, and also the design system overall would be usable?
Yeah. Absolutely. So, at the core of who we are as a design team, we bake research into everything we do. We don't actually really talk about research as a separate activity. In fact, we don't really use research as a word too much with our stakeholders. What we talk about are insights. So as we were making it, we were constantly doing studies, doing observations, doing all sorts of feedback, quanta and qual, around what was and wasn't working as we were building it. I would say that we were meeting with users every week during that entire 4 months. And that's the key, really. That's bigger than the design system. That's just kind of how we work. So yes, we were absolutely doing research and ensuring that even when it came to the product site, that it made sense to everybody. Reviewing our 90-second video about the pitch and the script and all the content that was in that video to ensure that when people saw it, they got it. They understood the perceived value right off the bat.
Got it. And since we are coming up on the end of the hour, we will take just a few more questions here. Unfortunately, we can't get to all the questions because we have so many. We still have 20-something questions left here, but try to go through a couple of common ones. So the last question that we'll actually take here is really around alignment. So what does alignment look like with the designers and teams who are responsible for EA's branding efforts, for instance? Do you all work together on the design system?
So brand is a whole nother conversation. So we actually at EA have another design system externally for all the EA.com websites and all that. And so that's where brand is sort of really heavily involved, and we are part of those conversations because we are users of that design system as well. When it comes internally, a lot of where Joystiq is being driven is we needed to start with a base in order to drive a brand conversation. with our partners in corporate communications and HR and marketing to understand, say, what an employee brand might be. From our research, we knew that that was high up on our executives' interests. There was no central team kind of driving that employee brand. So what we did was just say, we'll start with something in order to drive the conversation, but we are not responsible for brand. So what we do is say, put this plant plant this flag in the ground. This is maybe what it is, in order to really start spurring those conversations for the teams that are responsible for brand. So they're doing that work now. And what we're then going to do is, once they establish and provide, say, actionable feedback, we'll then incorporate that back into Joystiq as, say, the employee brand. And because then it's easily updated through a sketch library or a Git package, anybody who's a user of that just has to update the library or the Git package, and they're on the current version. They're never going to be sort of outdated or using something that is off-brand.
Got it. And the last question actually we'll take was, so with the design system, how is work prioritized? Is it based on team requirements, or do you have, for instance, like a list of items that need to be done?
For the system itself, work is prioritized based on the products and projects that we're supporting. So rather than just creating random components, everything is driven through the work that is funded and prioritized by the business, quote unquote. So that's how we determine how that's done.
Got it. And on that note, I think we'll actually close out the session. So everybody, thank you for joining us today and coming with such great questions. We hope to see you folks at the UXPin demo, which is in about 15 minutes here, if you're curious at all and how UXPin might be useful in helping you create your design system as part of your process inside of your design tool. You should check that out. That's starting at 11:15. Otherwise, yeah, everybody, this recording will be sent out sometime next week. And yeah, great job, Ryan.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you for having me. Really enjoyed it. And you know, if you have other questions, just catch me on Twitter. I'm over there.
Great. All right. Take care, everybody. I'll see you in about 10 minutes here on our next demo.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Yep.